I invite you to imagine that we are sitting together at the kitchen table, or perhaps at your dining room table, the place where you have on many occasions sat late into the night with a parent, a partner, or a friend. And though on this night we peel back that which divides us and focus on what brings us together, let us allow that on this night there is nothing that separates us, save for, and those of you who are fasting, I hope will forgive me, for I imagine that as we sit at this family table, I imagine we are each cupping a mug of tea between our hands, our fingers interlocking around that mug, but that's all that I imagine between us.
It's empty.
Empty. Kosher for Kol Nidre, right. Let us imagine that tonight we have come together at this table with nothing between us but our mugs, and we have come together to share a word about our lives, of ourselves, our hopes and our fears, with a friend, with a loved one, with someone whom we trust and with whom we can trade our secrets. Tonight, let us agree that we will be speaking with one another in the spirit of the Talmudic dictum that teaches, Devarim hayotzim min halev nichnasim el halev. Words that emanate from the heart enter into the heart. For tonight, this is how I wish to speak with you, from my heart, and I hope you will listen with your hearts open as well. But before we speak heart to heart, before we speak, I need to say something. It's a confession, really. Tonight is a night for confessions, and mine is that I'm frightened. I'm really frightened. In recent weeks, I have been frightened that anything I might say in this sermon risked either being misunderstood or misconstrued, or that I ran the risk of being seen as having gone too far. And as I began to actually put my thoughts to paper, I began to fear my words might be perceived by some as political and by others as prophetic. And I feared that all might consider me, by the time I was done, an alarmist. And of course, I feared that having put my words out there, they and I might be treated as a piñata. Or perhaps that's Michelle's fear for me. Our kids know there's lots of candy inside. But you know what frightened me, even more than sharing with you good people my fears? Not sharing my fears with you tonight, because they weigh heavily on my heart. As I consider daily my personal fortunes and that of my family, and as I consider with you annually on this night what it is that we share this span of years, and as I consider on this Kol Nidre Eve the future that we will bequeath to a next generation, I note that all of us are incredibly fortunate. We each have an enormous amount for which to be grateful, yet nonetheless, I'm frightened. That is my truth. I'm really frightened. Charles Dickens knew it is the best of times, and it is the worst of times. Or in the words of first century Tana, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, woe is me if I speak, woe is me if I do not speak. Will you allow me to share with you a story? This summer I traveled for 2 weeks with an organization called FASPI, Fellowships at Auschwitz for the Study of Professional Ethics. FASPI is an interdisciplinary graduate-level fellowship for students studying law or medicine, business, journalism, and for careers in the clergy. Specifically, over the course of our 14 days, I traveled with 14 seminarians from nearly as many faith traditions, along with fellow faculty, to Berlin, Germany, and Krakow, Poland, and less than an hour outside of Krakow to Auschwitz, to focus on the perpetrators. Principally, we focused on the ethics of professionals, the good and hardworking people, members of professional classes, the business leaders and the intelligentsia, the educated and what some of us might refer to and others might dismiss as the elites. Over the course of the 2 weeks, these future faith leaders and my fellow faculty and I were exposed to and explored how in a civilized society, such as was the Federal Republic of Germany in the 1920s and 30s, well, how such a society and its erstwhile civilized citizenry, including its clergy and its upper classes, fell victim to all that transpired. How for their having duly allowed their democratically elected leaders to profane and to pollute the public square with hate speech and social hierarchies, to disregard facts and sow dissent and distrust of both information and authority, save that of the leader himself. And all of this coupled with a consistent disparagement of one's opponents and ostensible enemies, while offering nothing but disdain for precedent and principle. In objectivity's stead, the citizens of Germany in the 1920s and 30s were offered propaganda full of a leader's lies, brazenly shared in his inimitably styled rants and screeds. Humbly, our fellowship of future faith leaders examined how the tacit complicity and accepting silence of a civilized society's professionals and educated classes, how through their silent, perhaps self-interested acceptance, good, principled, prosperous people were complicit in allowing their once open society's ethics and science, its culture and claim to superiority, once the envy of the world, to become the parade example of what happens when, in the face of malevolence and evil, a society and its citizenry fails to police itself against a noxious nationalism masquerading as a politically opportune populism, and for all the ways they should have known and should have acted that might have thwarted and arrested the enemy of democracy, the pure evil that was unleashed in their name. You can imagine the conversations we had in the course of our time together over those 2 weeks in June. At length, we discussed and debated where were society's good and God-fearing citizens. Yes, their Catholic priests and Protestant clerics, but too, we queried, where were the church-going folk and the faithful secularists? The people, like you and me, where were they? And what could or should they have done? Where were those, we asked these future priests and ministers, preachers and rabbis, where were those who profess what every religious tradition insists? All human beings are created in the divine image. Where were those who believe all have been fashioned in the likeness of God? Where were those who hold, therefore, that all people, without recourse to their differences, are worthy of equal, inestimable, and infinite regard, and neither one's race, nor religion, nor national origin, nor one's personal self-definition ought be a barrier to their receiving equal treatment under the law? We reject the idea that some people are more worthy than others by virtue of their birthright, their pedigree, or their privilege. And where were those who understood, as all religious traditions insist, that how we speak to and of one another, this is as important as what we say. As my mom used to admonish me, Aaron, she'd say, it's not only what you say, it's how you say it. Those who weaponize words and use language to delegitimate entire groups of people, dismissing them, for example, as deviants and rapists, or demonizing all immigrants as akin to an infestation full of disease, and those who call on canards and calumnies of old while trading in the latest taunts and tropes of the day, these persons are not intellectual masters. They are masters of manipulation. Politicians who use propaganda to inflame passions and to replace reason with fear, they so inveigh for one purpose only: isolating entire races, religions, and classes of people. And as even small children understand, when such talk is condoned, let alone excused, it's not long before violent language gives way to violent acts. And while we may not yet be able to draw a straight line between hate speech in general and any given act of hate-inspired violence in particular, we do know that violent talk can, at minimum, encourage lone wolf violence, and it can also slowly normalize political violence, turning discourse and ideas that once were unsayable and even unthinkable into things that are sayable and are thinkable. Where were those, we asked of FASB seminary fellows, where were those who profess what every religious tradition insists? Text and law have meaning. Words matter. Facts are stubborn things. And repeating a lie frequently does not magically make it come true. And significantly, as we taught the theologians, leaders have a particular responsibility to value and promote veracity over prevarication. Curious innuendo must never be allowed to pass for credible information. And one candidate's confidence in conspiracy theories must never be considered the same as another's attachment to truth. Data and opinion are not the same, and we ought to seek to share an objective and common understanding of reality, and what we profess to know for certain ought to be verifiable. If you will permit me the honor of quoting from the late novelist Toni Morrison's 1993 Nobel Prize acceptance speech, may her memory forever be a blessing. Oppressive language does more than represent violence, it is violence. Oppressive language does more than represent the limits of knowledge, it limits knowledge. Whether it is obscuring state language or the faux language of the mindless media, whether it is the proud but calcified language of the academy or the commodity-driven language of science, whether it is the malign language of law without ethics or language designed for the estrangement of minorities, hiding its racist plunder in its literary cheek, oppressive language must be rejected, altered, and exposed. Yes, we queried these 14 future faith leaders. Where were those who profess what every religious tradition insists, that we have a responsibility to respect a nation's norms and to encourage mutual trust and respect within and among all members of society? Where were those who should have insisted that we owe a debt of gratitude to generations past for our people's fundamental principles and for our culture's collective values? And we must all work to preserve our shared traditions and alliances. Where were those who believed that we all have the right to expect that a call that incites either verbal or physical violence will never be tolerated, let alone encouraged, and such boorish behavior ought never be rewarded with power. It is a responsibility we all have to commit to cultivating civility and trust in our union, confidence in our imperfect community, and faith in our blessed circle of allies and friends. Traditions and norms and mores are fragile and precious, and for this reason they must be both respected and protected. For such treasures of time are a cherished inheritance, one we are forsworn to preserve, to protect, and to pass on faithfully to those who will follow us. Yes, we asked those like us, where were we? Me and you in the pew, where were they who likewise had the moral obligation to stand up to incivility, to decry cruelty, and to shine a light upon the spectral shadow which slowly and then, as if all of a sudden, saw an entire generation lose its moorings? Where were the people who filled the pews on their holy days? And where were those who preferred to claim their spirituality and ethics as a private concern? Where were they? The good people, the people you and I would have known. Where were they? So anyway, that's a story from my summer travels. And for a time, I imagined that that would be how the sermon would end. Where were they? And then I would, of course, conclude with great dramatic flourish, where are we? I had it all planned out. And then I remembered Godwin's law. Have you heard of Godwin's law? Godwin's law is sometimes called Godwin's rule of Nazi analogies. And here's what it states. The longer a conversation online goes on, regardless of its topic or scope, the greater the likelihood becomes that something or someone will be compared to the Nazis or to Adolf Hitler. May his name be blotted out. It's not actually part of the law, but it should be. And since everything is, or soon will be, online, like this sermon, we can extrapolate Godwin's law to this very moment. And what if we turn Godwin's law around, I wondered? What if we started with the analogy? Now, starting a sermon, and not just any sermon, but Dafka a Kol Nidre sermon. And the first thing the rabbi does is to make an analogy, however cleverly worded, between present-day reality and the German zeitgeist in the run-up to what were the most horrific events of Jewish and world history? Perish the thought. Who would do such a thing? Certainly not I, unless I felt that it were absolutely necessary in order to grab our attention and to raise our community's awareness of the frightening seriousness with which I believe we need to take the very real risks our country is currently courting. And I do. I do believe it is necessary, and we ought know better than to summarily dismiss or discount the lessons of history. We ignore their warning signs at our peril. For when we choose to ignore or are indifferent to the significance of even incremental erosion of our essential values and principles, and when we underestimate the speed at which a sacred inheritance such as ours can be squandered and allowed to slip through our fingers, I genuinely fear that for our feigned ignorance, for our indifference, and in any case for our silence, the world as we know it will soon loose its tie to the universal truths and religiously revealed precepts that have been accepted and articulated and acted upon since the age of the Enlightenment. I worry that we are either unwilling or not ready to recognize the very real threats that, if given the upper hand, promise to undermine the very precepts upon which this entire country, upon which this entire wonderful experiment in democracy, and upon which her entire inclusive and welcoming and optimistic creed were founded. I tell you, in all honesty, heart to heart, for the first time in a long time, I'm frightened. On this Kol Nidre Eve, especially, when we are speaking heart to heart, it would be the height of irresponsibility for me not to acknowledge the obvious. We gathered less than 40 days and 40 nights since the entire Western world marked the 80th anniversary of the start of World War II. On September 1st, 1939, it was a Friday, Erev Shabbat, 80 years ago, last month. And today, once again, anti-Semitism is on the rise across the country and around the world. And while I do not believe the Huns are at our door, I do take anti-Semitism seriously, as we all should. At Rodef Shalom, we certainly do. The guards who now stand sentry daily at our doors testify to this. Your willingness to bear some of the costs and inconveniences of being generous in response to these new realities assures us that we are all in this together, and appropriately we shall continue to be vigilant. But I do not believe that anti-Semitism per se is the greatest threat to our lives as we know them in these United States. I do not come here tonight. Let no one suggest that I have. And I do not rise to speak to those who have it in for us. Tonight, those bad actors are surely not my focus. For even as sadly and tragically it is reported that a basic familiarity with Holocaust history is fading among the general populace, and even as the awareness of the atrocities perpetrated against our people by what was the most civilized country at the time in Europe, even as knowledge of these acts has plummeted in recent years among high schoolers across both our Commonwealth as well as the nation as a whole, and even as the increase in anti-Semitic incidents, especially deadly, as we know them to be this year, Zecher Sadikim Livracha, may the memories of the righteous be a blessing, even as anti-Semitism strongly correlates with all other forms of racism and bigotry. And for the record, persons of color remain the most frequent victims of hate crimes, though recent months have seen an alarming rise in the number of reported hate crimes targeting members of the LGBTQ community, with transgender folk being killed in record numbers. Jews, it's true, are the most often targeted religious group, but of late there have also been acts of hate and attack reported on Muslims and Sikhs. Even so, you heard it here first, I believe that this is the best time in all of human history to be a Jew. And beyond that, I believe that outside of the sovereign state of Israel, these United States remain the very best place in the entire world to be Jewish today. Full stop. But the times we live in are fraught, and I am afraid. But if I am honest, I must tell you, I'm afraid more of us, more than I am afraid for us. And this is why I want to talk with you. People of good conscience can disagree on matters political. Politics makes for difficult choices. But I am afraid that we have reached a point where, for want of a willingness to learn from history rather than dismissing its differences out of hand, we would rather remain in our separate camps than risk causing confrontation. And we would rather stew in silence than share what's real for us for fear of offending a friend. I know this fear. It exists for me in a very personal, familial way. But you know what really frightens me? That if it was hard to believe what was happening in Berlin and across Germany in the run-up to World War II, if it was hard to believe that what was happening was real, what with the increasing degradation and deceit, the devaluing of information and authority, the mockery made of jurisprudence and law enforcement, and the overturning of domestic and international norms, this is to say nothing of an executive encouraging what can only be described and understood as a political theology based on a strongman strategy, wherein it is proposed that there is one man who can alone redeem his citizens, his subjects from outside invaders and from those who threaten us from within. I'm afraid that at the rate we're going, as Americans and as Jews so successful in reaching heights of accomplishment and authority in realms as diverse as academia and business, cinema and commerce and cyber, economics and entertainment, medicine, retail, and tech, to say nothing of the successes we have enjoyed in reaching the highest rungs of power throughout our government. Especially well represented are we in all of its 3 federal branches. I fear nonetheless that we have done so well and settled in so completely and comfortably within this pluralistic and inclusive country of opportunity that we have grown so complacent, laissez-faire in this land of plenty. Sure, we've worked hard, as did our parents, but now that we've gotten ours, I fear we are ill-equipped. I feel worried that we're simply not prepared to recognize and to take seriously and to do all each of us can to address and to arrest the portents of what is an incredibly frightening reality for all of us. Our present reality isn't only not good for the Jews, it isn't good for any other minority or vulnerable population, to say nothing of such a reality not being good for anyone, not for anyone who loves liberty and cherishes the inalienable rights that drew all of our families to this country and has given each one of us so much. Let me leave you with this. The inhumanity that took place in the last century, it didn't start with gas chambers. It started with intolerance and hate speech and politicians dividing people, us versus them, the loyal versus the disloyal. It started not when cattle cars began to roll, but when people stopped listening to the lies and stopped looking at their lives because what they heard and what they saw was inconvenient and uncomfortable. The biggest lies aren't discreet, they're overarching. They're not incidental, they're spiritual, and they threaten to overtake us. Those of us who value ethics and spirituality and or religion, we know deep in our hearts, permitting people to be disparaged and public discourse to be devalued, sitting aside and saying nothing as science is rendered subjective, allowing authoritative knowledge and new information to be denigrated, and knowingly nodding and shaking our heads as narcissism is passed off as knowledge, tolerating leaders who sow distrust within a population, and permitting leaders to undermine a nation's confidence in itself, its own intelligence, and in its institutions of power, allowing anyone to govern their fellow citizens in such a way, this demands a response from us. And if we are unable to make a political change, then we must not allow such insidious and pernicious political behavior. We must not allow it to change us. We can be better than this. We must be better than this. So we shall determine to be. On this night of Kol Nidre, when we come before the court on high to plead our case, let us take succor and strength in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And here I paraphrase, "What we must do first is to repent for not just the vitriolic words and violent acts of the bad people, but the appalling silence and inaction of the good people. In a time of rising hatred, it's not enough to say, 'I'm not a hate monger myself.' If you are not actively working against hate, calling it out, Dr. King suggests that you are complicit in what is going on." Where were the good people, the FASB fellows, and we wondered? Where were the good people of all religions and none who understood the need to work together rather than at cross purposes, promoting peace within our polity rather than rewarding politicians for fomenting fear for cynical, short-term political ends? Where were those who appreciated the need to call out elected leaders on their lies and their slander, their libel and their specious assertions, their prejudiced pronouncements, and punishing public policies? All this is on us. As proud Jewish Americans, this is on us to do, not as partisans, but as full participants and loyal citizens in this great democratic experiment. So how shall we begin to respond to this overwhelming sense of frustration and fear? By redoubling our efforts and insisting, as Jews have always done, that in the words of a recent leadership statement signed by the representatives of each and every one of the entities that comprise the Reformed Jewish movement, we all have roles to play in stemming the spread of hate. And elected officials tasked with pursuing the common good, they have a special obligation to uplift rather than to diminish the public they serve. And this is especially true with regards to a leader. As taught by Pulitzer Prize-winning historian John Meacham, a leader sets a tone for the rest of us. And by word and deed, the leader helps tailor the habits of heart and mind. And thus, we must be the leaders. And we must demand of all our public servants the same basic modicum of civility and decency that we would expect of our children, of our clergy, of our colleagues, and of our kith and kin. And we could do worse than to expect and to insist that such normative behavior be on display towards all people every day and always. Our challenge as Jews on this holy night, our challenge at the culmination of these 10 days of awe, in these first days of the new year, 5780, our charge as Americans, as professionals, as protectors, as people in the pews across party lines, our charge as Americans and as Jews who love and help to lead this land, we must determine to devote our energy and our lives to working in unison. All of us must get busy, healing ourselves and repairing our world. I quoted her earlier, and I hope you will indulge me once more. 15 years ago, the late novelist Toni Morrison wrote words just as prescient and just as important tonight as they have ever been. And with this I shall conclude. Said she, "I know the world is bruised and bleeding. And though it is important not to ignore its pain, it is also crucial to refuse to succumb to malevolence. This is precisely the time when artists go to work. There is no time for despair, no place for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language. That is how civilizations heal." Chazak, chazak v'nit chazek. May we encourage and may we strengthen one another in times of fear. Shana Tova, Gemar Chatima Tova.